So I'm going to kick us off, welcoming everyone. Today, my name is Erin Worsham. I am the Executive Director of CASE here at Duke University, and also your host for this series. We're here today for our fourth and final session in the Innovating to Scale webinar series, brought to you by my team at CASE at Duke, and in partnership with, and with incredible gratitude to, the Kirby Foundation. And today I wanted to share just one quick extra note of gratitude. She'll kill me for doing this, but I want to just give a quick shout out to Kim Langsam, who you've seen her name on emails. You'll see her popping up in the chat, sharing resources. She's one of our experts on scale here on the CASE team and is really the engine driving all of the work behind this series. So big gratitude towards Kim and her efforts. And so as we jump in today, I know that some of you have been with us throughout this entire series, have been to all four of the webinars. And some of you are just joining us for the first time today. But welcome to everyone. And as we've done in each of our sessions so far, I am going to start our session with some introductory framing comments to set the stage. And then we're going to have a conversation with a featured impact leader. Today, we're thrilled to welcome Jonathan Reckford, CEO of Habitat for Humanity International. I am planning on asking him questions about our topic of the day, using data to power innovation and scale. But since this is our last webinar in the series, I've also warned him that I'm going to ask some questions about the other topics that we have covered throughout the series. So as we go, for everyone in the audience, feel free to submit your questions related to data or other topics on innovating to scale via the Q&A function on your screens. And I will do my best to track those and work to incorporate as many of those questions as I can throughout our session today. Okay, so with that, let's kick off. In each session thus far in the series, we have started with the story of One Acre Fund to keep a common thread throughout these four sessions. In session one, we talked about One Acre Fund's approach to achieving impact at scale. We talked about how they recognize that their core model, which we called their Engine 1, their core model of supporting smallholder farmers with a package of farming inputs, training, and financing was very successful. It scaled from a handful of farmers in One Acre Fund's early days to over 1 million farmers in a little over 10 years. But One Acre Fund looked carefully at the magnitude of need. They were serving 1 million farmers, and they recognized that there were 50 million farmers in sub-Saharan Africa alone. And so they recognized that their Engine 1, that core model, wouldn't be able to scale at the rate that they needed. And so they leveraged their core competencies to innovate and test potential Engine 2's other ways that they might scale impact. That included, equipping government staff to deliver farmer training, working with corporations to provide better farming inputs, advocating for policy change, and so much more. Then in session two, we talked about how at the core of innovation are the people that make innovation happen. And so as a leader, you must set a clear vision for change, build a culture of curiosity and experimentation, and structure and evolve the team to meet the changing needs. In session three, we finally addressed the burning question, funding. How do we fund innovation to scale? And so we spoke about strategies to attract flexible capital that will let you innovate and experiment, and to decrease the cost of what's needed for innovation. And so today, in our fourth and final session, we are going to talk about data. We picked this terrifying picture on purpose because I think data can seem really overwhelming and scary. But we've already seen how One Acre Fund is using data to make the case for scale. They analyzed their growth data to understand how many farmers they were already serving with their core model and to forecast the potential reach of that model. And they gathered and analyzed market data to better understand the magnitude of the need, those 50 million farmers across sub-Saharan Africa. And so they use data to drive them to innovate, and they continue to use data for ongoing learning and experimentation as they innovate to scale. So I want to talk about the 1 Acre Fund example just for another minute or two to illustrate an approach to innovation and using data along the way. First and foremost, what 1 Acre Fund did was they got really clear on their why and their key success criteria for innovating. For them, it was around first increasing impact for their clients, for the farmers. And so that meant that the data that they needed to track and improve was about improving yield for their farmers and whether the innovations would therefore increase income. Also, in addition to wanting to increase the impact per customer, per client, they also wanted to increase the number of farmers that they were serving. And so for them, the data that they knew they had to track was around adoption rates. Any innovation needed to be adopted quickly and efficiently by farmers. And also, very importantly, tracking costs to make sure that their innovations were cost effective and had the potential to scale. So 1 Acre Fund, once they had those critical success factors figured out, often starts their innovation process by conducting desk research to gather data and determine if an innovation or a new approach is worth pursuing at all. Does it have the potential to reach the goals listed above? But they don't just sit behind their computers, they get out in the field as well. We often talk about quantitative data being critical, but so is qualitative. And so 1 Acre Fund has a practice where they talk to farmers about their needs and also their farmers' ideas and potential solutions and innovations. They get feedback on concepts and they identify risks. And from there, 1 Acre Fund follows a lean testing approach where they start small pilots and then increase the size and the scope of that testing so that they can test key assumptions and gather data along the way. And that data, again, for them is related to impact. Is the innovation increasing incomes for their farmers? Demand, is it being adopted? And around feasibility, is it financially sustainable? Is it operationally feasible for them to pursue at scale? And so I wanted to share that 1 Acre Fund example. It's a simplified example of their innovation process, but I always think it's helpful to have a story before I talk about some of the best practices. And what you saw in that story is the idea of using data to first identify and frame opportunities, to see where the gaps are. Are your current efforts falling short in terms of the depth of impact you hope to reach with your clientele? Or the number of clients you hope to reach? Or perhaps there's a gap in an area closely tied to your work, an adjacency. For example, if you're working or running workforce development programming, but you're recognizing that attendance at your trainings is dipping, and figure out by looking at the data and talking to your customers that it's because of a lack of childcare options. And so maybe that's an area to innovate around. Identifying these opportunities through quantitative and also critically qualitative data from your clients about their experiences, their perspectives, their needs. And then second, using data to test and drive decision-making. So some best practices here, starting small to de-risk and identify the most important things that you want to test. Setting those key success criteria that monitor the balance between impact, demand or reach, and feasibility, including costs. And then finally, establishing early indicators. So an example I love to give here is when we're talking about innovating to scale, we might think about an educational program where you're working with elementary or middle school students in the hopes of increasing college matriculation and graduation rates. It's going to be a long time before you know for sure if those elementary school students are going to get to college and graduate 4 years later or 5 years later. And so thinking about when you're innovating and testing, what are the early indicators to show you if you are on track or not? In that example, it might be our attendance rates for your students in elementary school increasing, our perceptions from those students or from their parents about the importance of college increasing. What are those early indicators that you can use to track your progress towards impact? So those are some high-level best practices about using data to identify and test innovations. We'll dig more into all of that with Jonathan in just a minute. But your actual data, the actual numbers that you're collecting and the questions that you're asking are going to be different for each of your organizations. So I want to conclude by underscoring just a couple of key principles in using data to power scale. First, that data should always drive decision-making. I think we have a challenge in the social sector where either we don't collect enough data at all, or we collect far too much. And so we should always be asking ourselves, why are we tracking this data point? Once we get the results, is it going to make us do something differently as a result? Data should drive decision-making. Number two, metrics should center the client experience. Ensure that your data is keeping you accountable to your clients, your beneficiaries, your customers, whatever term you use. Keeping you accountable to them and what matters to them. Number three, consider what key stakeholders will want to learn. So maybe there's something a particular funder that you're targeting will want to know, or a potential partner, whether it's government or another nonprofit, et cetera. But I also want to just caveat this a little bit. Want you to think about this as a principle, but don't get out of control. Funders can get us out of control on all the metrics that we want to report on, or responding to everybody else's data whims. But you can also push back and explain how and why the data that you're collecting is important for your work, and why other data might be unrelated and distracting. And then finally, implementation is king. I feel like I have to make this point because we've talked a lot in the series about starting small and piloting and testing and trying new innovations. And that is incredibly important. Collecting data at that point of pilot is going to tell us whether we should continue, whether we should adapt, whether we should stop that pilot. But just because it worked in the pilot doesn't mean it's going to work when we try to implement it at scale. So your data needs continue throughout your scaling journey and are incredibly important that you recognize that as you implement the programs. All right, so as always, that's a fire hose of information on using data to power innovation at scale. But what we're going to do now is we're going to welcome Jonathan to the screen. So Jonathan, so excited to have you here today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Erin. Great to be with you all, and thanks for having me on today. And I think that's such a good framing for our conversation, but excited to be with you.
I hope it resonates because I'm about to ask you a bunch of questions to follow up on it. As I promised to the audience, I'm going to start with some questions related to data, and then we can see where it takes us from there. But you've told me before that you're game for anything, so I'm gonna put you to the test today. All right, let's start out with I just talked now about using data to identify the need and opportunities for innovation. And I just want to ask you what that's looked like for Habitat.
Yeah, thanks so much, Erin. For those, and I think most people know of Habitat for Humanity, especially in the US. We have a big brand. I think most people are surprised at how much we're doing that's not just the traditional volunteer-led building that is most familiar. So I think what most people know about Habitat is Jimmy Carter started and runs it, not true. And then we give away houses, also not true. So we're best known for two things that turn out not to be the case. But it's an interesting example of, first, I would say scale through repetition. And Habitat took a traditional model of that partnership self-help housing and went incredibly wide. So I think we peaked at 3,000 Habitat organizations in 103 countries. But I would say when I listen to people, and it's hard to believe I've been here 19 years, Habitat was known for great on stories, not so great on data. And we actually need both. I think to your point you just shared, hearts are changed by stories, but stories have to represent something that then is replicable, evidence-based, and shown that you can do at some level of scale in order to scale. And so I think there are data on multiple fronts. One is data to get people's attention. And I think sort of how do you frame the problem in a way that gets people to matter? And so if you looked at housing, which is our sphere that we are trying, our vision is incredibly clear, a world where everyone has a decent place to live. I think that's so clear, so aspirational, but everyone is a really big number. And right now we've got about 1.8 billion people living in substandard or poverty housing around the world, which is staggering. And that's actually so big it can get overwhelming. So then how do you bring data in a way that doesn't say, well, it's hopeless, I can't do anything about it, and make it a little more personal? And just a couple of US facts that are shocking and how bad the crisis is here. Right now, half of Americans are cost burdened for housing, meaning they're paying over 30% of their income on their rent or mortgage. And 1 in 5 now are severely cost burdened, paying over half their income. And then you think about all the implications of that. Or another way to think about it, if you aspire to own a home, and many of you may own homes, at the beginning of the pandemic, it cost about the income you needed to purchase the median home in the US was about $75,000. In only 4 years, that's now $115,000, which means a huge percentage of our country cannot afford homes, or cannot afford to be able to purchase a home. So those are examples of sort of the problem set. A different way to use data to think about change is Habitat was actually growing really fast, but then we actually calculated how long would it take to actually solve, to achieve our mission in the world, our vision. And I think when we calculated even at compound growth, it was going to be something like 1,032 years, which seemed unacceptably slow. And therefore, it said, okay, even though we're doing a lot of really good work in a lot of places, what would it take to actually drive the level of change we aspire to? And that really forced us then to change our framing question. And I think that's an interesting principle, from how many houses can we build, a really good question, to what would it take to meaningfully reduce the housing need in every geography that we serve, which is kind of a scarier question. But that led us really into systems work as opposed to just construction work, and led us down a path towards advocacy and policy, and also what we call market development, of actually trying to change the housing markets in a way that would allow far more families to be able to improve their own housing, and to be able to track. So I loved your point about what you measure, and then thinking about what's going to drive, and then thinking about the lens of all the different stakeholders, because what the community cares about doesn't always necessarily align. And then how do you build, influence all the stakeholders that are required to actually create systemic change?
Mhm. Okay, so much for us to dig into. I'd love especially that last point about, well, let me say two things. One, I'm always so impressed talking to you and other impact leaders about how the data rolls off the tongue, right? You've got it all up in there. And so a great just live example of the importance of data for storytelling and getting people's attention, as you said, but then also for that reframing of Habitat's approach. And so I just want to like +1 on that to make sure the audience really absorbs that. It's very similar to that 1 Acre Fund example, where they were saying, we're doing this model, it's working, we're getting awards, everybody's loving it, we're growing, it's amazing. And then to say, actually though, it's not going to get us to the place that we want to be. And so 1,032 years with the model that you had, how do you reframe that? So incredible example of Habitat using data to reframe and make the case for innovation. I'm curious though that, Habitat for Humanity International, huge, enormous organization. And I know that many of our attendees on this session are running organizations with a smaller footprint. And so I'm curious if you can give us an example of how this all plays out at a more local level in the Habitat network. So maybe how a local affiliate is using data to identify opportunities for innovation.
Thank you. And for those of you who are less familiar, we are a federated organization. So the way we operate in the US is we have about 1,030 local Habitat affiliates that do the local work. And then we work in 71 countries. And so all part of this broader movement and federation. And to go close by, Duke is in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, one of my favorite examples, because this is one I physically saw over multiple years and got to watch unfold. But one change was moving from building to housing systems at a more local level. It was moving from the idea of building individual houses wherever we could find land to thinking about holistic community transformation. And that, of course, is way more complicated. And you made a really important point, which is the data needs to start with the community. And I'm going to give an example from Winston-Salem, North Carolina, not too far away from you, where it was a community known as the Cherry Street community. It was the informal name, historic African-American community that had languished for a long time. And it was disinvested, families were moving out, and yet it was well located and close to downtown. You had a lot of potential assets. But when we listened to the community and both the formal and informal leaders in the community and asked, what's your vision of change in the community? There were a couple of key data points from their perspective. One, success would be that young families would move in, not out, and they would be a place that would attract young families. And two, do something about the crime. It was a highly unsafe area, which correlated with why people would leave when they had the opportunity. And you had drug issues and crime issues that were making it less attractive. And the housing stock was in really poor shape. And one side observation I'll make is when you think about change, one of the dangers in our sector is all of us sort of say, if you just do our thing, you will solve the problem. So housing people would say housing is the solution. Education people will say education is the solution. Health people will say health is the solution. Jobs people, et cetera. And the practical reality is to create transformation, all of those pieces actually have to come together and work together. And one of my axioms is the only thing worse than partnering is not partnering, because partnering can be slower, it can be harder, but it's essential to long-term change. So this first partnership is with the community itself, and that you're not doing for, you're building with, which is a deep principle of ours, and that we're coming alongside leaders in the community to help affect their vision for change in the community. So one of the huge issues was a lot of blighted housing. And Forsyth County made a first commitment that they would tear down and build new homes right at the entry to the community. So 16 new homes replacing empty, blighted, and boarded up housing that was in really poor condition. And based on that commitment, a number of private real estate people came in and made commitments to buy and fix up housing. And then another nonprofit said it would come up and rehab some historic, architecturally interesting rental housing and fix it up. And then with that, the city made a commitment to a greater police presence and to some community improvements. And we got 5 universities in the community to all make commitments in support. There was a commitment to a new charter elementary school to create a strong magnet. And you started seeing the pieces come together. And this is not data, this is the story side. I came 2 years after all of this started to dedicate those first 16 houses. And a policeman named Billy was showing me around the community who was volunteering. And he said, if you'd been here 2 years ago, I would have been here to protect you. And then with this big sweep of his arm, he said, now look what we've done. And the city manager said when he gets depressed about things, he actually drives through Cherry Street to remember what's possible when everybody comes together. After 2 years only, crime was down 70%.
Wow.
Important data point when you think about safety. School was launched, and now you had a place where parents of young children wanted to be. If I showed you the before and after pictures, it's just sort of viscerally dramatic when you look at sort of when you drove into the community, what it looked like. And then Habitat doubled down, and now they've built over 100 houses. They actually moved their offices into the community. They moved their restore. We run housing thrift stores, into the community, created a tool lending library, and extended the training we do for Habitat home buyers to any family in the neighborhood who wanted to improve their credit, improve their knowledge, or improve their housing, and created a tool lending library. So you started to see families upgrading their housing because now they had a vision of their neighborhood moving in the right direction and changing. And I give that a little bit of a longer story to show, it can't be one lever, but if you can start to do all the work to get multiple levers in place, then you start to see a tipping point, and you see a neighborhood that had been consistently going down becoming an inviting. And I don't want to candy coat it. All this is hard and slow and messy, but you can see real transformation take place. And I think it's I would maybe a cautionary tale too on data is one of the dangers of scaling is we go after things that we can count big numbers on, and undervalue kind of the deep transformation. And we need both. So I am thrilled that we are moving from thousands to millions, but also you don't want to unintentionally devalue or undervalue the deep transformation work that's required in some of our traditional work and our community development work, if that makes sense.
I love that last point. And in our last session, I mentioned the book Lean Impact by Anne-May Chang. And I love the discussion in that book around vanity metrics and the idea that I think she calls it a disease in the social sector, that we focus on these metrics that are just about numbers. How many students can we serve? How many houses can we build? How many XYZ? Without checking ourselves to say, is that actually creating the impact that we are trying to seek? It's not just a numbers game. Numbers are important. One Acre Fund wants to reach more farmers, but not just for the sake of reaching more farmers. You want to house more people, but not just for the sake of like building more houses, but actually putting them on a different trajectory in their lives and changing the housing system and everything that comes with that. So I love that last point about the importance of data, but the right data, and being careful about vanity metrics. I also love the example of Forsyth, not only because it's right down the street from us, but wrapped up in that, you talked about the importance and the sort of best practice that they followed of really engaging in the community, the build with, not for, understanding the problems from the perspective of those we're trying to serve. And that's where they identified some of their solutions and ideas for innovation. I then heard you talk about them identifying those kind of critical success factors and thinking about young families moving in, not out, and also about the crime numbers, which is not necessarily where my head would have gone first, to say, what are the critical metrics that we need to be tracking in a housing organization? I get the correlation of crime, but I wouldn't necessarily have put that front and center. So really thinking about what are the metrics and the data points that drive the impact. And then finally, what I want to tease out from that example is just the starting small. 16 houses. I mean, I'm sure that didn't feel small at the time to the leaders of that organization and the community, but not saying we're going to transform all of Winston-Salem. We're going to start with 16 houses at the front lines of this community to see what difference we can make and how that can then expand and scale from there. So not to recap everything you said, Jonathan, but there's so much goodness in there. I want to just pull it out for our audience. I'll also say to the audience, one of my favorite things about Jonathan are his axioms. So he already gave us one. What do we have? The only thing worse than partnering is not partnering at all. I've used that before, so I'm excited. We're going to do an axiom count as we go through, because I'm hoping you give some of my other favorites. But let's shift from here. I'm sure folks are going to have questions about like the details of that Forsyth example and how it happened. But I want to dig a little deeper into, in that example or in others, as you and the teams are innovating to scale, how do you think about measuring whether those new approaches and innovations are working so that you know whether to continue them or when to stop and say it was a nice try, but that's not it. We got to do something else.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, because I think one of the risks in the social sector is mediocre ideas can live a very long time. If you can find a few friendly donors and keep on. And so I think the private sector has more rigor, because if you don't make money, you're out of business. Now you could argue, but so in some ways, the social sector doesn't consolidate and scale as efficiently as it could, because you have so many small scale champions. And And I think that is a potential challenge we can face. And honestly, it's a muscle we're not as good at, which is what to stop. We're better at what to start than we are at what to stop. And I think that's where I liked what you said, and it's so important, which is what does being clear on the front end of what success looks like. And you know, we can have a danger of piloting everything. Now, a strength actually of a big federated organization is anything you think of, someone is trying somewhere. And then the question is, can we add some more rigor to those trials? And I would say there's two risks in a way that we have faced. One is somebody does something amazing in one location, and everyone starts copying it without fully understanding, was that amazing because you have a supernaturally gifted leader or a context that was unique and non-replicable? So you can sort of tilt to copying a non-syndicatable idea too quickly without doing the understanding it. The flip is missing great ideas and not getting them out to the rest of the network. And so in a way, the role, one of the roles that you know our the Federation Service Center can play is to do that monitoring, evaluation, learning, to make sure, one, what is actually working and why, and then two, to make sure that we are sharing the best ideas and helping them out. And then I think if you have clear success criteria on the front end, maybe later we'll talk, are by far the two biggest bets when I talked about moving from kind of direct building, and not instead of direct building, we weren't going to do less of that, but moving towards systems. The two big bets for us were policy advocacy and policy change, and then we're around markets and systems and really working on markets. And our giant two bets, one was around property rights, and we had, there the problem was very clear. In so many countries, women and marginalized groups did not actually have the legal right to own their land. And if you think about housing, that is such a fundamental prerequisite to the next steps, because if you don't know that you can stay on land, it doesn't make sense to invest. So there, at least the sort of the identification of the problem was pretty clear. Then the question is, what are the best ways to address it? So we created a global campaign to wrap around that called Solid Ground, where we could create learning communities and share across the different countries what they were working on, how they were designing, what policies they were driving to try to make, and then we could count who was being enabled, which is different than actually getting the realization would be a woman gets property rights and then improves her housing because she knows she can stay. But it's a huge first step. In Bolivia, one of my favorite examples, women did not have the right to own their property. And if you think about divorce, inheritance, abuse, all the challenges that come with that, it was a huge deal that we had this incredible cadre of tough Bolivian women that we trained over a number of years. And finally, they not only got the right to their own property, they got the federal law changed so that if a man is married and wants to register his home or his land, it has to be joint titled. So that's that is, we would call that changing the enabling environment, meaning 1.8 million women suddenly have the right to be landowners. And you think about now they have a financial asset for the first time, and all the implications of that in terms of being able to borrow, in terms of being able to have access. But full success would be then they get they would actually get the legal title, not just the potential title. And in a different way, maybe we can talk later about how we tested housing we created a new asset class in global microfinance for home improvement lending. And that was probably our best example of testing rigorously and then going big. And so in some ways we had a period of years, which I would call divergent, where we said, okay, you have permission to do all the stuff you're secretly doing, countries and local affiliates, but we want to learn from it. And we had 5 years of blessing what had usually been sort of cultural taboos in terms of experimentation. But then out of that, we picked a few and started then converging around the big bets in terms of what we thought we could actually take to a larger level of scale.
I love all of this. I have so many follow-up questions. Let me ask you one that just comes to mind as you're talking about building houses. And I know there's innovations around that. You shifted from not just building new homes, but repairing existing homes. The restore thrift stores that you mentioned as a financial sustainability. There's innovation happening in that model. But then you're also just talking about innovating along the lines of markets and property rights and policy change, et cetera. I can imagine sitting in the audience here, again, if I'm running an organization that maybe is just here in Durham, North Carolina, and feeling overwhelmed by that. and just wondering, do I need to take all that on myself? Like, how do I decide what's within the realm of what makes sense for my organization and my leadership to innovate on and test, versus what's more, mission creep or scope creep? So I'm curious to just get your reflections on that.
It's, I think that clarity is really important. And I always joke within our own federation, one person's innovation is their neighbor's heresy. So what are the,
Mm,
what are the principles? And I think I've shared with you before, another of my favorite axioms is be religious about your principles, but not your tactics. And the
mhm,
principles and values have to be the frame in terms of measuring, is this still in scope and on mission for us? But the tactics can change. So for instance, a tactic we've used just in the US, but not in other countries, we changed this 40 years ago for other countries, was to give zero interest mortgages. Now that's a subsidy tactic, but that's not a core principle. The principle is making the house affordable. Now, if we can get subsidized land instead of subsidized financing and it makes it affordable, the family doesn't really care that much. They care, can they afford the payment, not how the subsidy shows up in the financial structure. And so to me, that was an example. But for some people, we were violating a principle. To me, that's just tactics in terms of how we make it affordable. But I think going through what are the core principles, because you never want to violate those, versus what are tactics to achieve your mission within that is important. Another, certainly maybe because it's when I joined, it was pivotal, and this is certainly not new to me, but can you use a crisis to accelerate change? And change can be hard in mission-driven organizations, and social sector tend to be super mission-driven. And therefore, when I joined, we had the Indian Ocean tsunami in Southeast Asia, huge, massive housing disaster. And then right as I started, Hurricane Katrina hit the US, a huge regional housing disaster. And we were designed to build a few houses in thousands of locations. And suddenly we needed to do a lot in small locations. But the crisis was big enough that one, we raised a ton of money, and two, because of the urgency of the crisis, we had permission to tip some sacred cows and do things that wouldn't have been culturally acceptable and different. So we helped 25,000 families rebuild after the tsunami, and after Katrina, built over 6,000 houses. So we were the largest home builder in two states for a long time, which showed the market wasn't working, but it also showed, that was a different level of scale. And we were able to take those lessons then about what works and share the lessons that spurred some of the acceptance of change that might have been harder. And I would say, if to your question, those are big numbers, but the same principles would be true at a smaller scale. And in some ways, we are built as an amalgamation of a whole lot of these different changes happening at a small scale. And I think about the power of policy and advocacy. I mean, right next door, Orange County Habitat is broke ground a couple of years ago on a fantastic 250 home mixed income community with parks and new urbanism, and it's just beautiful. Now that's the good news. Bad news is it took almost 19 years from when they got the initial piece of land to get that approved in the most liberal town in North Carolina. And so, getting the stakeholders to play, and it's amazing, doesn't matter you're liberal or conservative, people inherently get selfish once they own a home about letting anything they perceive as damaging their property values be near them, even though it's actually a myth. Habitat raises property values, it does not detract from property values, but not in my backyard is a huge deal. So that's a policy side of it. I think for any nonprofit, in a way, you've got to figure out your programmatic strategy, and then you got to figure out your funding strategy. And the money is not as much fun, but if there's no funding, there's no money, and that can be a mix of earned income. Actually, Aaron and I were talking. I gave a talk just this past weekend, and I was talking about how when I went to business school a million years ago, there was not a mainstream view that we needed professional management of nonprofits, which now seems so obvious. But it really was not viewed that we needed the same skills that are needed in the private sector were needed in the nonprofit social sectors. And now I'm meandering a little bit, but the point I would make with that is the lines are actually blurring. And I think I like social sector better than nonprofit sector, because in a way, the idea we would define our sector by our tax status does not make a lot of sense.
Mhm.
And what's really interesting is there's so much innovation happening in the social sector that's bringing it actually more towards market solutions. And I think the lines are blurring in the private sector in similar ways. So you've got businesses that are B Corps, you've got businesses that are measuring their ESG impact and thinking about their social impact in deeper ways and looking for shared value. But you've got nonprofits in the social sector like Habitat that have, we have now billions in mortgage receivables. We have this, it's actually, want to talk about an interesting scaling with data. We could talk about our stores because we had amateur management of a really good idea, which are Habitat restores. And by training our store managers, we drove everybody who went through our Habitat store university. We saw on average sales went up 33%. And in retail, of course, you're so sensitive to sales. And we had a donor who invested maybe $7 million in the vision of making the stores a bigger deal. And he was kind of disappointed because the person who was driving the strategy was had rolled out Starbucks and was so passionate. And he'd set $1 billion target. And we only moved the revenue from 350 million to about 700 million, but we didn't hit $1 billion. So it was like, oh, did we fail? But as a chain, those 1,200 stores have moved from about 70 million of unrestricted income for the local affiliates to 170 million of unrestricted income. So if you thought 10 years ago you could invest $7 million and create an annuity of $100 million, it's probably the best ROI of anything a donor's ever invested in Habitat.
Yeah. Let me ask you a quick follow-up on the restore example, and then I want to pivot to a couple of questions on people and funding, some of our other topics from the series. But I think the restore examples, having these thrift stores to earn revenue for the local affiliates is such a good example of innovation and doing something differently for Habitat. So I'm curious to have you think back to the beginning of that strategy. You just told us the end, right? Like the incredible impact and funds that it's raised. But at the beginning, you had no idea whether that was going to be true. So what are some of the things that you think the teams that were doing the first restores, what they did right in terms of innovating around that model of, give us like one or two best practices that you said, we nailed this, everyone should do this when they have this idea for the first store before it becomes the restores that we know now.
Great idea. And I think a couple of things. One, not surprisingly, all the cool ideas start in the field. It wasn't someone at headquarters saying we should invent restores. It was a local Western Canada affiliate who actually came up with the first thrift store. And then it spread more virally. And then what we started looking at was actually getting the data. So perfect to today, which was we had stores, and it wasn't even a bell curve. Version of results was so wide. So the first thing we did was actually capture the data and figure out, and then we started looking for the trends and giving the data back to the stores, because then they could start benchmarking themselves. And we had stores that were run by people who didn't know how to do retail, which seems like an obvious idea, but maybe hire somebody who actually knows retail to manage the stores. And we came up with in this case, using and ranking and publishing all the performance data, got people's attention because now they could see, oh, other people are doing way better than we're doing, and a bunch of stores were losing money, which is, of course, the opposite of what we want to do. And so I think it was a good example of a good idea spreading, but without some of the disciplines that were needed to make it really successful. And I had such a random career, but one of my surprising stops was running a retail chain. So I'm a recovering retailer, and there are rules of how you do retail well. And the cool thing about the restores is not only is it an earned income strategy, it's keeping hundreds of thousands of tons out of landfills every year, but even telling that story. And one of the ahas that was very uneven was you had people running good stores, but they weren't telling the customers and the donors the engaging with the store was directly turning into people getting houses. So building out the brand walls and connecting the story so that when you donated your used appliances or whatever else could be reused and kept out of a landfill and put back in, you could connect the dots to this is directly helping someone in my community have the chance to buy a home. And in the same way, helping the mission of those volunteers and people working in the stores in the same way to be excited about it. And even people buying stuff in the store, you want them to make that connection.
I love that. So great kind of best practices on listening to the ideas from the field, from the front lines, of using the data to identify trends and see what's working, what's not, and adjusting as you go. And then a little bit of that competitive, using data to have people compete as you start to scale it. And certainly the point about earlier about implementation is king, right? Like, easy to do maybe the first store, but then as you try to replicate it quickly in other locations with other people, the challenges that brings along the way.
The other quick comment I would make, since I went way afield of your original question, which is if you're smaller, you don't have to do it all yourself. And something we're trying to scale now is the dramatic power of just getting a family off a dirt floor in the global south onto a cement floor. And the health impacts are staggering, but we didn't have to do all that health research. We had partners who actually had done the research, and then we could bring the data from the research to say, hey, if you get a family off a dirt floor, the change in cognitive development is almost impossible. It moves children's cognitive development from 31% to 94%. I mean, it's a staggering health income or health outcome, excuse me, or that just that difference of a child being able to play and move around and then being off the dirt also means the drop in insect-borne illness and all these other negative impacts is really staggering. But when we started doing that work, in fact, it's even better to have a health organization touting the health impact rather than Habitat touting the health impact, though we can then build off that to bring it back. So thinking about how do you not just partner, but how do you leverage? Because one of the things that I think is frustrating is donors want the evidence, they want the impact, but they often don't want to fund the monitoring, evaluation, and learning work that's expensive. And so one of the muscles we have had to build better is how to build that into all of our proposals and explain, that it's not free to get that evidence, and we actually need to invest in that.
It's a great segue, because one of our last session was on funding innovation to scale, and the challenges of that. And so, we talked in that session about the need for flexible funding, bringing existing funders along on the innovation journey, finding new funding sources, et cetera. I just kind of open-ended question for you. What's your advice to our audience about financing their innovating to scale journey?
I think the good news is there's a group of donors who love new stuff. And so, but I think one of the surprises, and it was one of our biggest, I think, success stories, but biggest bets that was harder than I thought to fund, was this whole area of housing microfinance. And what surprised us is actually our longtime donors who loved the mission and got it, actually were excited about coming in on innovation. But new donors who hadn't already connected and built a relation with the organization, it was kind of far afield to go to them with our most far out innovation, even though we were so excited about it. So in this case, it was convincing. The bet was, could we convince the microfinance world to start doing home improvement lending? And we started with small bets. And I think that's I'd encourage, which was, how could you start building evidence? And the belief was, you could only do a microloan to a low-income family for a small business because that would generate the income to pay the loan back. What we had observed, and I've been on the board of a microfinance federation, is that when I talked to mostly women taking out those loans, every time I would ask, what are you doing besides reinvesting in your business? I always got the same two answers. I can get my kids in school and I'm fixing up my house. So we knew there was this huge unmet need for home improvement. And we started loaning our own money and training in a few countries, microfinance banks to start housing portfolios, and we took the risk. And then we measured it and found that the actual repayment rates for home loans were actually higher than the small business repayment loans, because there was such demand and so few alternatives, because only about 5% of the population in a lot of these countries have access to a bank loan for housing. So there just isn't, there was a market gap. And then based on that, we went to bigger tests. And then based on that, we launched our first wholesale fund, which even for us and for our investors was a big stretch. So we borrowed $90 million. We raised a $100 million fund and went big and hired a fund manager. And we did that 12 years ago after probably 5 years of tests. And what I'm so excited about is, these are great numbers. The not only is the fund going to pay back the debt holders and pay a nominal return to the equity holders. We never promised a market return, but it directly helped 1 million people get home improvement loans. And what's most exciting is we've now loaned out, the 100 million has gone 2.5 cycles. We've loaned out 240 million wholesale. The banks that we trained and loaned to have put in 1.1 billion of their own capital. So now we've started to actually demonstrate market effect. So 10 million of equity is
created a market.
4 billion of capital and about $500 a loan. That starts to be big numbers, millions and millions of families a year. And some of our partners who had never done a housing loan, one in Peru is the biggest home lender in the country now, housing lender in the country. So we're now going to raise a $500 million fund, which we have a lot of work to do, to take it further, because we really wanted to see if the market would start seeing this as an asset class that is viable and show it at a level of scale that would mean people have access. And then we've gone into building materials, skilled labor, training the families, trying to think about the whole housing value chain and make it work. But I do think you have to do it in state. You can't go from that was a big leap for people to think Habitat would do something like that. And so you have to pull them along on the journey. And I do think the evidence is incredibly important. So bringing that data back, but it's not, if you sort of think about donors, there are analytical ones, there are visionary ones, there are people-oriented ones, so you actually have to decide based on the donor, do they care most about the why? Do they care about the how? Do they care about the who? And sort of designing pitches to kind of cover all those bases. But if there is no funding, no matter how cool the idea is, it's a challenge. The other one, which is really unnatural but hard, is to team up with partners and go for funding. And I think sometimes we limit ourselves because funding is competitive and we're scared that if we bring in partners, they'll get the money and we won't. And it creates some negative behavior. But I actually think donors want to see a more holistic solution. So if we can come in with a health and education provider and housing and talk about a bigger vision of transformation, that brings a different kind of donor in. And it is in the near term, you need the seed donors, but then when you start going bigger, you actually need investors. And that takes a different level of rigor than the heart donors who'll just feel good giving you a check. But usually as you start to get bigger, you got to move from that to people who are going to be evidence-based and think larger.
You think about the data needs as your work evolves, and often the rigor of the data required continues to go up and up. I love those takeaways on funding innovation to scale, though, like starting with the small bets to start to build the evidence, understanding what matters, the who, what, where, what matters to donors, and then teaming up with partners to go after funding is a great suggestion as well. I cannot even believe that we're just about at the end of our time. I have so many more questions I want to ask, but let me just close this out. I'll give you a minute, Jonathan. I'm going to ask you, what's your final parting piece of advice for our audience and for leaders that are trying to innovate to get to scaled impact?
I think what I would say, because we're not as good as we have to be, is fight for clarity. And I think one of the dangers is if it's a little bit fuzzy. There was a famous seminary professor who taught preaching, and he said, if there's a mist in the pulpit, there's a fog in the pew. And I think sometimes when we have, you need vision, but you've also got to have vision followed by kind of rigor and discipline, because I think we tend to go too wide and therefore dilute our impact. And that organizations that I think drive the most change are really clear on what they're trying to do, and then have a clear, I think the jargon is danger, but have a clear theory of change. So we have a hypothesis of, here's the problem, here's how we think we have a solution that's unique or differentiated to solve it, and here's how we're going to go about that. And the more, I think you need to translate that into plain English, other than for the foundations who speak our strange foreign language. But having that, I think often you can go a long way without being sufficiently clear. And I think then showing there's showing for that innovation why first it's a great idea, and then two, why your organization has the credibility to achieve that great idea and how it's a natural evolution of what you're doing. And so if the innovation is completely unrelated to everything else you're doing, it's going to be a tougher bet, but showing it. And then I would say you made such an important point earlier, which is having the discipline to pick your spots. So do some small bets and experiments, but I think one danger is spreading yourself so thin that you install these new ideas, but you don't realize the benefits of why you're trying the innovation. So if you're going to go for it with enough resources and enough energy that you actually don't have a false negative in terms of great idea but poor execution, and therefore you abandon it because you didn't give it enough time and energy, and therefore that even more pushes back towards the discipline to not try 100 innovations at once, but to really have some strong filtering, and even harder, the permission to sunset things you're already doing that may be okay and even good, but not great, and are sucking up the resources you actually need to go for the big ideas.
I love all of that. The fighting for clarity, discipline to pick your spots, permission to shut things down. And I think so much of that resonates with what we've talked about throughout the series. What I'm going to do in our final 2 minutes, I am going to share my screen one more time, just to kind of close us out. Fascinating conversation today, and we've had some incredible conversations throughout the last weeks of this series. Some of those takeaways from the series, I'm not going to talk through them all because of our short time, but we talked about how innovation does not have to equal invention. And Kim, I think if I'm seeing what everybody else is seeing, just popped up a poll that we'd love for you to answer as I'm giving our parting thoughts. That related to what Jonathan was just saying, centering your why. That's all about being really clear about why you're innovating. We don't need to innovate just because. Why are we innovating? Actively managing risks and trade-offs. That innovation by nature is change. Change requires careful change management. So think about your people, your staff, your funders, your board members, and bring them along on the journey. And then start small, iterate, and like we've talked about today, learn from the data. So as everyone's continuing to fill out that poll, we really appreciate your feedback and data so that we can improve for the future. Just, parting thought for me is it's been such a blast to get to do these 4 sessions and talk with incredible leaders like Jonathan about innovating to scale. And for all of our audience members, we hope that this series has helped serve as an inspiration to you, to help you think about the likely gap that exists between current efforts and the scope of the problem that you are trying to solve. And we also hope that this series and the incredible leaders you've heard from have provided some tactical ahas that will help you use innovation as a tool to narrow that gap and increase the impact that you're already having on the people around you. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And thank you, Jonathan, for being with us today. I hope everyone is inspired to go off and innovate and create change. And we look forward to hearing more about it. Thank you, everyone.